In 1993, Sega unleashed Virtua Fighter into arcades. This revolutionary polygonal fighter took the world by storm and enjoyed enormous success, particularly in Japan, where it topped the arcade charts for months on end. Yu Suzuki had been tasked with creating a fighting game that would challenge Street Fighter II's arcade dominance. Virtua Fighter achieved not only that, but changed the face of the industry itself, redefining how characters and camera movement could work in 3D, driving rival Namco to completely retool some of their projects and being a key influence in the final design of the Sony PlayStation. A sequel was inevitable, but in the face of a rapidly changing industry quickly filling with copycat 3D fighters, would Virtua Fighter 2 stand out in the same way that its predecessor did? When creating the original Virtua Fighter, Yu Suzuki's AM2 studio split up into two teams. The first focusing on the original Virtua Fighter, the second on Daytona USA. Daytona's development, which overlapped with Virtua Fighter's, was done in tandem with the creation of Sega's new Model 2 arcade board. This board was designed to be a significant upgrade over its predecessor, the Model 1, with Yu Suzuki feeding his requirements directly into Sega and Lockheed Martin during its creation. It's not overtly stated when Virtua Fighter 2's development begun, but various articles and interviews with Yu Suzuki himself tie the development of the Model 2 board to Virtua Fighter 2, with features such as texture mapping, which Sega paid Lockheed Martin $2 million for, being a key component. This makes sense in a way. Daytona USA was the pilot project for the hardware, developed while Suzuki-san worked on the original Virtua Fighter, with Toshihiro Nagoshi, famous for creating the Yakuza franchise, being the key producer on that project. Virtua Cop also only had Yu Suzuki in a supervisory role, with Katsunori Itai and Akihito Hiroyoshi handling the senior programming duties. Yu Suzuki did produce Desert Tank, but this was done in partnership with Martin Marietta, perhaps part of the hardware agreement itself, and likely not the project that Yu Suzuki had in mind when he asked Sega to pay 2 million big ones for new arcade hardware. So it would be fair to surmise that while Yu Suzuki was prepping Virtua Fighter 1 for the arcades, the work had already begun on its sequel, which Sega would use its new flagship hardware for. With the hardware locked down, work began on the Virtua Fighter sequel. 4 new characters were designed, but only 2 would make it into the final game. To date, no trace of these additional combatants can be found, and no, they aren't Seba, and they aren't the guy with the buzz cut from the tech demo. The reason that AM2 gave for keeping the number of playable characters to 10 was cited as a way to encourage emotional attachments to the characters, as they felt a larger cast would diminish this level of player engagement. For the 2 new fighters, Yu Suzuki travelled to China to learn more about the martial arts he was implementing, which is evident in the new characters themselves. Shun Di hails from China and uses drunken kung fu, while Lion Raphael is a French fighter, but his fighting style is of the northern praying mantis martial art, which is also derived from China. Another improvement over the first game was that every technique was now fully motion captured, something that Yu Suzuki claimed had only been done in hospitals previously. Finally, while developed alongside the Model 2 board, Virtua Fighter 2 would actually release on the board's upgrade. The Model 2A board would be practically identical, with the exception of being able to support a far larger ROM size for all of that motion captured animation data, something that would be a consideration for a future home port. Virtua Fighter 2 was shown to the public at the 1994 Amusement Machine Show in September, before hitting Japanese arcades in November, over 1 year on from the first game. Just like the first game, Virtua Fighter 2 was an arcade phenomenon in Japan, perhaps even more so. In Western media, coverage of the arcade game was unanimously positive. Outlets praised the visuals the most, whether it was the 60 frames per second output, which was double that of the original game, the high fidelity texture mapped fighters, or the way their movement made the combat so much more realistic. The graphics received universal acclaim. The visuals may look quaint by today's standards, but they were the visual benchmark in 1994, with some magazines giving them a score of 99 out of 100. But Virtua Fighter 2 wasn't a one-trick pony. Its beauty wasn't just skin deep. Hundreds of new moves had been added with characters old and new, benefiting from an increased repertoire, which, combined with the improved visuals, yielded a far more tangible experience than the first game. Playing the game emulated via a Model 2 emulator could never replicate the majesty of seeing this titan on a huge rear projection screen in your local arcade, but the emulation is close enough to judge the game on its own merits. The intro remains artfully epic, channeling kung fu movies and kung fu demonstrations, with Shun-Di's antics interspersed with the main cast duking it out. The character select screen has music that does a great job of amping the player up, and character portraits really do demonstrate the graphical leap over the first game. The sweeping opening camera angles of the first game are retained and improved on, flaunting those stunning visuals even more. The announcer's digitised voice screams go and the fight begins. The first stage opponent, Lao, is a pushover to ease you into the game. As a newcomer, you may slam your palms into the punch, kick and guard buttons randomly and be amazed at how your character reacts and the thumping impacts as their attacks connect and Lao crashes to the arena floor. Whether it's by depleting his health bar for the KO or forcing him off the arena stage for a ring out, the feeling of victory and the game's visceral realistic feel is addictive. Sarah follows and puts up more of a fight against a stage set during a storm with an epic backing soundtrack. Although if you're playing as Sarah's brother Jackie, the stage will switch to the city-themed Chicago stage. Shun-Di will follow in the most visually impressive fighting arena so far. The stage itself floats along a river under a fully 3D bridge that passes overhead. By the time that you get to Pi, the difficulty curve has certainly swung upward, and if you manage to best her and then newcomer Lion, Jeffrey stands as the gatekeeper for the latter half of the game. The difficulty is paced nigh on perfectly in Virtua Fighter 2, and you'll need to improve as you make your way through the cast. Of course, once you reach the end of the game, you'll fight the game's boss, Dural. Just like the first game, it's a one-shot deal. If you lose, you'll need to play the whole thing again from the start to get another crack. Virtua Fighter 2 absolutely holds up today, but on release, it was the multiplayer component that won Japanese players over. Just like the previous game and Street Fighter 2, the real longevity was on the competitive side, and soon tournaments were taking place all over Japan, some were even televised. This footage shows off the sort of vibes that you'd see at the likes of EVO years before those tournaments would even gain mainstream attention. That's how much of a big deal that Virtua Fighter 2 was. It would become the highest grossing arcade game of 1995 and ultimately one of Sega's most successful arcade titles of all time. The launch of Virtua Fighter 2 in November 1994 coincided with the release of Tekken in the arcades around the same period and the Sega Saturn with its own port of Virtua Fighter 1. And it goes without saying that Virtua Fighter 2 was a quantum leap beyond both of these home console powered fighters. Of course, the question was, could the Sega Saturn bring this state-of-the-art arcade game home?
A Sega Saturn port began almost immediately after the release of Virtua Fighter 2 in the arcade and Virtua Fighter on the Saturn. Before the work would start in earnest though, Yu Suzuki and AM2, who would be handling the port in-house, set themselves another task. Virtua Fighter on Saturn had been a sales phenomenon in Japan and had garnered praise across the world. However, it wasn't without its compromises, and with the team rushing a port of Daytona USA to the hardware, the need for better development tools to navigate the Saturn's complex arcade-style architecture was becoming more pressing. And so AM2 set out to create the Sega Graphics Library, a suite of 3D focused development tools that made the advanced features of the Saturn hardware more accessible, navigating some of the challenges developers faced in the first wave of Saturn software. The SGL was developed alongside Virtua Fighter 2 as well as Virtua Cop and quickly established itself as one of the most exciting developments on the Saturn. On 24th of March 1995, just a week before Daytona USA on the Saturn would hit Japanese stores, Sega held a press conference where they showed off a very early demo of Virtua Fighter 2, running at a smooth 60 frames per second on Sega's 32-bit console. Another rolling demo was rolled out in June for attendees at the 1995 Tokyo Toy Show. At just 20% complete and showcasing only 4 of the 11 fighters, it looked astonishing and would blow onlookers away with just how smooth it was. Further progress was made over the next 6 months, showcasing more fighters and features, as well as things like the HUD and more moves being slowly added. Interestingly, the version showcased at ECTS in the summer was only 20% complete, showing that a lot more work was needed between then and the target December release date. A playable version of the game was finally showcased in September as the Japanese launch date in December neared. The rapid progress from 20% to completion was largely thanks to the Sega graphics library that Virtua Fighter 2 was developed alongside. But AM2's biggest challenge wasn't just the visuals. Those rich animations that meant the ROM size of the Model 2 board had to be expanded, they needed to fit on Saturn. To solve this particular problem, they worked hard on compression techniques, and to hear it from the AM2 interviews, this was the feat that they were most proud of. The various demos and previews had been well received, and the reception from audiences and media alike had been overwhelmingly positive. Some developers had even remarked on how Virtua Fighter 2 was doing things on Saturn that were impossible on PlayStation. The hype was building, and after a tumultuous 1995 for the console, particularly in the West, the Saturn finally had its ultimate killer app. In Japan, 1.5 million pre-orders of Virtua Fighter 2 were made. There were reports that the Sega Saturn was outselling PlayStation by 6-1 in the region on the strength of VF2 alone. The game released on 30th November 1995 in the US and the 1st of December in Japan. Here in the UK, we had to wait until January 1996 to get our hands on it. Regardless, in gaming media worldwide, Virtua Fighter 2 garnered universal acclaim, a 9 in Edge, perfect scores in Next Generation, GamePro, Maximum and others, and 90 plus scores in almost every gaming publication. The Saturn port wasn't just a straight arcade translation either. In addition to the arcade and versus modes, it added a team battle mode to allow players to pit 5 combatants against one another. It also featured both the original Virtua Fighter 2 and the updated 2.1 revision, which included various changes to moves and hitboxes. Options allowed you to change the size of the ring, making it huge or tiny depending on your preference. Also amongst the plethora of options is the ability to select an arranged soundtrack for use in the game. This music would later form the basis for the Virtua Fighter's themes in Fighters Megamix. From the arcade, 2 hidden modes are made active and accessible in the Saturn port. The first is ranking mode, whereby players are given a single credit to get as far as possible before being graded for their efforts. It's a mode where players who have mastered arcade mode will get the most benefit, as it's not just how far you can get, but how quickly you can beat it and how well you use your moveset that is taken into account in your final ranking. But most impressive of all is the expert mode. In some versions of the game, this mode is greyed out if you don't have enough storage space, but if you do, it offers a challenge unlike any other game. That 180 blocks of Saturn storage space, yeah, that's all to store the AI from expert mode. What this does is it puts you into matches against CPU opponents that learn as you play. Think of Forza Horizon's Drivatars and you're not a million miles away. This results in a unique experience where your Saturn controlled opponents will learn your moves, learn how to defend them, and act more like a genuine human opponent. It's a revolutionary feature and one we hadn't seen since, or at least not implemented in a similar way. The Saturn port was a visual masterclass. Fighters sported lower polygon counts than the arcade, but that extra detail that the Saturn could apply via texture maps made up for this, resulting in characters that looked amazingly close to the original. Backgrounds were cleverly done with VDP2, the Saturn's secret sauce. Rather than detailed 3D environments from the arcade, which would have eaten into the fighter's details, in Saturn Virtua Fighter 2 the backgrounds are 2D but move, scale and rotate to give the impression that they are 3D. Layers of parallax add depth and while details like Shun's bridge and the fence on Wolf's stage are missing, the running river on Shun's stage is not. It brings the stage alive unlike any other fighter of the time, especially in comparison to Tekken's flat 2D stages. But most importantly, the gameplay was arcade perfect. Whether it was version 2 or 2.1, the Saturn is a match for the arcade in terms of physics, moves, hitboxes and frame data. From a gameplay perspective, it was perfect, and once the awe of the visuals had worn off, it's the gameplay itself that is Virtua Fighter 2's greatest accomplishment on the Saturn.
Such was Virtua Fighter 2's success and renown that it would be ported to consoles beyond the Sega Saturn, effectively being the only game in the series to have been ported beyond its initial generation of consoles. Virtua Fighter 1 would see ports to the Saturn 32X and PC, but nothing beyond 1996, unless you count the emulated Astro City Mini version. 3 has never been ported at all, and 3TB remains a Dreamcast exclusive in the home. 4 and 4 Evolution never got ports beyond the PS2, and 5 has remained PS3 and 360 only in all of its forms up until the recent Ultimate Showdown remake that came to PS4. So Virtua Fighter 2 is unique in this regard in that it has been ported to systems outside of its main releases era. Before we go forward though, we'll have to go back to the humble Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, where Virtua Fighter 2 received a sprite-based interpretation in 1996. This purely 2D offering is interesting, given that in terms of moves and animation, it's certainly impressive, but without a polygon in sight, it's barely Virtua Fighter, and even less so its sequel, given it's missing both Shun-Di and Liam. Still, it's an interesting interpretation. After that came the PC release in 1997. Based on the Saturn port, not the arcade original, the PC release, when fully 3D accelerated, does actually outshine the Sega Saturn version in terms of polygon counts, allowing you to use the arcade character models. But it does suffer in terms of backgrounds, lacking the unique architecture of the Saturn's VDP2 to do more than just present the backgrounds as static images. It's also an absolute pig to get running on a modern PC, and even on release, it sounds like it was a pain. This image here, I had to run through my OSSC from my PC back into my PC in order to make it capturable. What a nightmare. Anyway, in 2004, Virtua Fighter 2 came to the PlayStation 2 as part of the Sega Ages 2500 collection. This version looks impressive at first glance, but when you look closer, you see the visuals are a step behind the arcade original, which was 10 years old by that point. Gameplay also feels a little off, with noticeable delay in some of the attacks, and this sentiment was actually reflected in reviews at the time. In 2012, some 18 years after the arcade original, Virtua Fighter 2 came to the PS3 and Xbox 360. Developed by M2, this version is essentially an arcade-perfect port cleaned up and upscaled for higher resolution displays. It's arguably the best way to play it, especially since it features online matches. It's interesting then that every single port offers something different, from visual makeup to gameplay fundamentals, and unlike the original Virtua Fighter, there are ways to play it today that are truly faithful to the arcade original. And Virtua Fighter 2 again is the only game in the series to have had that luxury, being ported in some cases completely arcade perfect to home platforms up to 18 years after its original arcade release.
Where do I begin with my memories of Virtua Fighter 2? They're etched into my mind both in the arcade and on Sega Saturn. I first seen the Saturn port in action thanks to the cover mounted VHS that came with issue 1 of Sega Saturn magazine. There was actually 2 demos on that tape, The first was a character movement demo featuring Pai and Lau on Jeffrey's stage, which was first shown at the Tokyo Toy Show in 1995. The second demo featured several characters facing off against one another, including Wolf and Jeffrey, but most noticeable was that only their throws worked. There was no actual collision detection for punches and kicks, although the build was only 40% complete. Still, I was blown away by the fluidity of the movement and the detail on the fighters and the backgrounds. It was a game that I knew I had to have, and sure enough, in January 1996, my uncle picked up a copy from Beatties, and I remember just staring at the back of the box while sitting on the train home, taking in every little detail of those tiny little screenshots on the back, just dying to get up the road and play that game. Loading it up, nothing could prepare you for what you've seen. The VHS footage never stood a chance of portraying the pin-sharp picture of RGB SCART, and just like the original Virtua Fighter, in the eyes of the 16-year-old me, this was the arcade game intact and absolutely perfect at home. As the years have gone by, the Saturn version of Virtua Fighter 2 remains my favourite way to play the game, irrespective of the Xbox 360 version on Xbox Live Arcade, or even Model 2 emulation. The game just feels at home on the Saturn. It was the 3D fighter of the 5th generation that remained unmatched on Saturn until 1997's Last Bronx by AM3. In fact, it was the 5th generation 3D fighter that was unsurpassed, or unmatched at least, until Tekken 3 on the original PlayStation. It took PlayStation 3 years, the best part of 3 years, to catch up with Virtua Fighter 2. For me, Virtua Fighter 2 remains the greatest technical achievement on Saturn, even taking Last Bronx's pseudo 3D backgrounds and enhanced use of VDP2 into consideration. With Virtua Fighter 2, the series cemented its almost symbiotic relationship with the Sega Saturn, and it's no wonder the game went on to become the greatest selling title on the system in terms of global sales. So while many call it one of the finest 3D fighting games ever made, for me, just one word sums up Virtua Fighter 2. Icon.
My first personal exposure to Virtua Fighter 2 wasn't in the arcade, unlike Virtua Fighter 1. Instead, I only saw the game in magazines between 1995 and 1996. In fact, during that time, my overriding memory is playing the first game on a standard upright cabinet in Gatwick Airport. So my first exposure to Virtua Fighter 2 came via the Sega Saturn port. It would be 1996, after months of saving my birthday and paper round money, that I would finally get my hands on my own Sega Saturn console. The 3 games that I got with my system were Sega Rally, Daytona USA and of course Virtua Fighter 2. After being blown away by the first game in the arcade and having seen the overwhelmingly positive reception to the sequel in the media, I couldn't wait to play Virtua Fighter 2 in my own home. When I unboxed the console, I was baffled by the lack of an RF cable, instead finding an RGB SCART adapter in the box. This meant that I couldn't hook my system up to my little 14-inch bedroom TV. So instead, I had to hook it up to the living room telly, a 32-inch widescreen that we'd rented off UK chain Rumbelows back at the time.
Oh, don't you pay anymore, Mrs. Moore?
On this setup, that was worlds beyond my own meagre bedroom offering, I was able to bask in Virtua Fighter 2 exactly as AM2 had intended. The rich and sharp RGB image beamed from my CRT was unlike anything that I'd ever seen before, and coupled with Virtua Fighter 2's high resolution visuals and blistering frame rate, this made me appreciate the next generation jump more than any that I'd seen before or would ever see again. My friends would similarly be blown away, and even when they got PlayStations for Christmas, the likes of Tekken 2 with its lower resolution blocky characters set in drab diorama environments looked unfavourable by comparison. But it was the gameplay that really sung. While I had flailed around aimlessly in the arcade original, Virtua Fighter 2 in the home allowed me to truly hone my skills and grow into the game like I had done with Street Fighter 2. Virtua Fighter's 3-button setup was approachable, but while simple and accessible, the skill ceiling was sky high. I experienced this myself with the higher difficulties and extra modes, which I was better at as a kid than I am now, and that was even more apparent when seeing top tier Japanese players lock horns, and the game was an absolute favourite for years and years between myself and my friends who would still play it even after the Dreamcast release. Virtua Fighter 2 remains a high watermark for the series, even after various sequels and updates. Even after the content-rich Fighters Megamix, I would still go back to this magnificent fighting game on the Sega Saturn. Emulation and Xbox 360 ports might offer more arcade-accurate experiences, but for me, there is still nothing quite like playing this marvel in the home on the Sega Saturn. Despite being ported to some 4 platforms after, Virtua Fighter 2 remains synonymous with the Sega Saturn. Arguably the biggest of Sega's big 3, it became the best-selling game on the system and a darling amongst critics. Unlike the other Sega fighting games, Virtua Fighter 2 is the one that Sega is keen to keep available to gamers new and old, not only in the ports in the systems up until 2012, but its presence in the Yakuza, Judgment and Like a Dragon games as recently as 2023. For years, Virtua Fighter 2 was the fighting game to beat. In the arcades, it would be usurped by Virtua Fighter 3 2 years later, but in the home, from a visual and gameplay perspective, it wouldn't be until Tekken 3 that its position as top dog could be considered taken, and that's an opinion shared by Tekken's head honcho Harada himself. Like Virtua Fighter, the sequel never gained blockbuster popularity and the rest in the way that the series did in Japan, but unlike the original game, it doesn't have the honour of changing the industry. But despite all of that, even though it was more a case of evolution than revolution, such was Virtua Fighter 2's strong basis and Virtua Fighter 2's incredible improvements, that its legacy as a fighting game classic is set in absolute stone. In 1994, not only was this game the best looking fighting game in the world, but it played just as good as it looked. And when it came home to the Sega Saturn a year later, it brought home everything that made the arcade an instant classic. While there were more popular fighting games in the era, Virtua Fighter 2 was the top of the fighting genre for a time. Not flashy or famous, but a dignified king that ruled the world of 3D combat. This has been the Sega Guys, and we will see you on the Sega side.
I'm faster than lightning!